we just finished off last lesson at the bottom of these asterisks. So just moving forward, we see this conversation between Patrick and Clara, and basically he's asking about Ambrose, and she just simply says the word later, which to me just indicates that Clara is in control, and that's a big aspect of their relationship throughout. That she's the one that sort of dominates their relationship, because whilst he might like to think that he can have an impression on her, she's way more experienced in relationships than than he is. Sorry. Then we go into this next section. He found himself at this hour in the spell of her body within the complex architecture of her past. Okay, so it's an interesting quote, really nice language, but it really sort of shows how possessive he is, and how this leads to jealousy. All right, so she's talking about a man that she had a relationship with, Stump Jones, and she actually married him, and that for Patrick is like a very difficult thing for him to cope with. He doesn't know how to react to the idea that Clara has had past lovers, and possibly many of them, and he just, yeah, it's like he'd like to know what to do, but he's just really not equipped, in this sort of relationship with this sort of woman. But he's infatuated with her, and we'll see how infatuated he is as we go. Then in this next quote, we've got hello. He breathed towards the pale green speckled body hanging against the pane. Just let me put that there. And the note I wrote about this was that he's still like, so this is Clara's iguana, and he's still quite like, sort of focused in on that connection with natural sort of things. So connected to the natural world, and like I said, this is the iguana, and he in fact at some point like sort of looks after the iguana. So for him, it's just a consistency of his behaviour and his character, okay, to be sort of engaged with the animal in the natural world. Then we've got this idea of love was like childhood for him. Now this is, generally speaking, you would imagine that this sort of quote would indicate something really nice. But remembering his childhood was quite isolated, it could be a little bit of a mixed image. The idea, though, to me is that he has a more romantic view um, of love, compared to the reality of love. So his view of love is from that childhood where he didn't maybe have those sort of deep relationships, particularly with his father, and obviously no sort of maternal figure. And he craves that. So, like, to him, love is a romanticized view. So when he compares it to childhood, in his childhood, the idea of love was intoxicating because he didn't quite have it. So maybe the reality of love in the real world is a little bit different. Then it goes on, you've got, again, some references to different animals. And then it gets down to this one, I have a fear I won't see you again. So there's a sexual relationship started here between the two, Patrick and Clara. But straight away he's like, really, he sort of feels the temporary nature of what's happening. And I don't think it's consistent with his character to have like a sexual relationship that is temporary. It's not like he would want to have just this like, sort of love affair. He'd want more like depth in that. But I guess based on what he's going to be able to get from Clara and what he can't get, he's going to take what he can get. So she's basically saying while she's sleeping with him, and then like they're lying together, that I'm going to go and see Ambrose. So for her, the sexual nature of their relationship, the intimacy might not be as deep as it is for him. Okay, it's sort of, to me, like an uneven relationship between the two characters, because for her, sex isn't the same as it is for Patrick. It's far more significant for him. Then we have this sort of dream where he had been found sliced in two. So when when he sort of like, this is the idea of how he finds Small or Ambrose in this sort of dream, and to me it's representative, like, if you believe that um, dreams represent people's, sort of inner sort of subconscious, that there's a bit of guilt from Patrick, because he is with Ambrose's lover, and in some ways it is again knowledgeable to him. He knows that she's with him. She knows he's going to go back, and still, he's encountering her in a romantic sort of relationship that is probably, essentially, it's very clearly inappropriate if she's going to leave to go and find the man that she was already with. The idea that he'd been sliced in two is sort of, again, commensurate or paralleled or connected to the person before Nicholas, who was severed when he was doing the same job as Nicholas on the bridge. So you see that at times Ondaatje, makes these connections. They're subtle. They're not like necessarily clear. Like, it's not clear why Ambrose Small and Nicholas Templeploff's predecessor would be like connected. But it's hard not to say that there isn't a connection of some description when they're essentially basically explained in the same way. So again, this is a question for you. If you can find that connection and find a way of sort of explaining that, that could be a good piece of analysis. I don't have a clear idea myself of what I would say about that. Okay, so then we move forward, and he says, oh, sorry, no, let me go back a bit. Okay, so then there's this sort of sex scene here that's quite explicit, that I'll go through in class, just about the nature of why that's of any relevance to us. But you would have probably read that and sort of thought that's a little bit more. It's not necessarily that romantic sort of intimate sexual encounter. It's a little bit more graphic. And again, I think it's purposeful from Adanche. He doesn't need to do it, but he chooses to do it, for purpose. And it sort of shows the sexuality of Clara, and I guess it shows Patrick being prepared to experiment sexually because of her influence, which doesn't, again, probably necessarily seem consistent with his character. But, he is, like I said, he's totally besotted with her, and he's going to do whatever it is that he thinks, she thinks is something, that she sort of values or thinks is okay. Then we've got this quote after that sexual encounter from Clara, which says, "The only way I'll ever get to know him better will be to sleep with him." And then, this next sentence is quite interesting too. Seduction was the natural progression of curiosity. We would probably quite commonly, refer to this behaviour as quite like amoral. But it shows us what Clara is like. She's a sexual being. She doesn't see sex necessarily as a long-term commitment. She sees it more as a way of connecting with people. So it's interesting because, again, that's not necessarily our perception of the world that we live in, but it's certainly her perception, and it is the perception of many people. But it shows what Clara is like. Sex is a means to an end, a way of sort of finding some sort of connection with people. So that's quite different, I think, to how we would sort of term a sexual relationship. And I think it's probably consistent with how Patrick might see it as well, that he might be quite shocked by the way that she sort of behaves around sex, and he probably thinks there's some intimacy and a real connection between them, but she's maybe not as immersed in their sort of very brief relationship. And then he goes on to say, he wanted to exercise Ambrose Small from Clara's mind. And to me, that's naive, okay? It's naive when she's just told him that, she uses sex as a tool to get to know people better, and those sort of things. I guess it sort of suggests then that he doesn't really fully understand the way that she sort of behaves around that sort of intimacy. He wants more, and he thinks, he could potentially, have such an intense relationship with her that she will forget about Ambrose. But I don't think that's really necessarily what's going to happen. In this section, I'll skip this and talk about it in class. But this sort of idea of some of the language that Ondaatje uses here to describe their relationship and the way that the way of their sexual relationship. So I made comment in class about they made love in one, and then you've got more graphic sort of sexual terminology, and it does sort of really shift the focus, I think, to a point where you sort of look at it and go, this is almost animalistic. It's very simplistic the way that they're having sex. It's not loving. It's an action. It's more about the animal sort of instinct of sex. So that really changes the focus, I think, of the manner in which different people use that aspect of a relationship. Okay, so obviously for Patrick it might be a real sign of intimacy, but for Clara it's a real sign of experimentation, and that's how she feels a deeper connection with the men that she is sort of sleeping with. Then it goes on. He was drawing out her history with small, a splinter from a lady's palm. So he wants to really understand what it is that they had. And he thinks that once he understands it, he can just take it out. Now, that is, hopefully you can sort of read what I'm typing in here. But again, I think there's a naivety there, that if he thinks if he can just understand it, then he can just take it out, and then that's it. But realistically, there's something a little bit more embedded than a splinter here. Okay, I think she's quite obsessed with Ambrose as well. There's something deeper about their connection than just the sexual relationship that they shared. Because if it was just that sexual relationship, I think she could probably walk away from it. But I guess we'll find too that once she's had sex with someone, she finds a real deep connection with them. But she can have that connection with multiple people. Okay, she's not sort of obsessive about one person, which I think Patrick becomes at certain points, particularly in this stage of the novel. Then she says she's sort of explaining to him, to Patrick, about her time with Ambrose and this man Briffa that was Ambrose's best friend, and she makes this sort of flippant comment that there was a time where I could have slept with his friend Briffa. And I asked this question then: how loyal was she to Ambrose? If she would sleep with his friend, and if she would sleep with his friend. And I believe that she would, like, based on her character. I think that she would have slept with his friend if she thought it to be, relevant to her. But it sort of shows the way that she connects with people, and she doesn't really have a big issue of sort of looking at it and going, "Oh, what does this say about me?" She's just happy to sort of connect with people on a different level, okay, in just a little bit of a different manner. Then we get to this. There was a wall that no one reached, and this sort of sort of sends us back to Patrick. So we're sort of, to me, like sort of hop from a focus on Clara and who she is, and then a focus back on Patrick and who he is, and how those two characteristics together sort of combine to form this relationship that is probably illogical. Okay, you've got a man who's probably quite reserved and quite sort of limited in his openness because of his childhood, and then you've got a lady that's really open and really expressive, in a sexual manner. They don't really seem to connect together, but somehow they've got this relationship, even though it doesn't really make sense based on their two characteristics. So this idea of this wall that he put up, he wants to get to know her so badly, know everything about her, but he's got a wall that no one will ever reach. And again, that to me is a product of his childhood. He is sort of somewhat reserved because of the way that he grew up. Okay, and we are, as people, a product of our experiences. Then we've got this idea of tiny stone swallowed years back that had grown with him, and which he carried around because he could not shed it. Basically, uses, just increases this idea with a motif of the stone, and that it's just a part of him. It's part of who he is. It's something that it's been there so long he can't sort of get rid of it. And then we've got the end of this little section. So we are built, and this to me is the essence of the novel. So we are essentially framed by our experiences. They haunt us if they're negative, or they limit us if they're not positive. They can be inspiring if they're great. Like, this is who we are, human beings. So we are built. We are built by what happens to us in our lives. And I feel like that is a simple sentence, but one that takes a little bit of reflection to really sort of see that this is, even in the context of him trying to honour the immigrant workers, and look at the different Canadian aspects of this sort of part of history. The commonality is still, this is humanity, okay, and humanity is always the focus of great literature, because it is the question that we endure, we ask, we don't know the answer to. Then we get this. It takes me a long time to forgive. Okay, this is Patrick talking to Clara, and Clara says, "Don't worry, Patrick. Things fill in. People are replaced." So this, to me, is like the real contrast between the two characters. They have very differing ideas about what life is about and what the world is about, between the two characters. So when we read this, we sort of got to go, how on earth are they actually, finding this sort of sense of connection when Patrick's saying, I won't forgive you if you leave me for Ambrose. And Clara's saying, that's no big deal. Someone else will come and they'll fill in my place. People are replaceable. So Clara says this, but in some ways, I guess she's still going back to Ambrose. So I guess she doesn't think Ambrose can be replaced. So there's a little bit of contradiction there, but it does show, I think, quite clearly that they're not the same people. Now, this is an interesting sort of part of the text. I think this is another sort of important aspect of what the text is about. He wondered if at first she had been something he wanted to steal, not because she was Clara, but because she belonged to the enemy. So the enemy to me is, the rich, the upper class, and that's sort of Ambrose, and she belongs to this by association. So we see this sense that he's not even then sure of his own motivations. Is he in love with her, or is he just infatuated with something she represents? It sort of goes to a little bit more depth in terms of what sort of inspires her. Then the end of this section says, as he held her, he still didn't know who she was, and I think this is the truth of the matter. That she really doesn't understand. He doesn't really understand who she is. But to me, it's unusual that you would say that after you've just had a sexual relationship, because you would generally know who someone is if you were going to take that step. But like we've already encountered, Patrick wanted her more than she wanted him, and she uses sex as a bit of a tool to get to know people, and she doesn't see it as quite the depth of value. So it gives us a bit of an indication of the two people and what they're like.